Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Channel 4's Samira Ahmed and the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us. The idea of this session is that I'm going to ask you some questions shortly, and then very much a session for everyone here to ask their questions of you. But I think it would be useful initially, as it's your first experience of Civil Service Live as the Deputy Prime Minister, 7 weeks or so into a new government. What are your initial thoughts?
First, of overwhelming gratitude, actually. I really do want to just convey my heartfelt thanks for everything you've done to make strangers to governments such as Liberal Democrats, we've been strangers for, 80 years or so, so welcome. And this is obviously very new territory for Britain politically to have a coalition government. It arose in very unusual circumstances, and the work you have done, and everybody's done in the civil service to make us feel welcome, to adapt to the new kind of dynamics of a coalition government, is really just, amazing. And I now feel wretched with guilt that I used to rant about faceless bureaucrats. Now that I can put faces to that, I feel very guilty. So I apologise with hindsight and won't repeat those rhetorical flourishes. But no, I really am very, very sort of grateful to you indeed. And also, not only grateful, but actually hugely, hugely impressed by not only the skills which have been sort of on display to me and everybody else in government, every day since we've come into government, but also the kind of resilience with which I feel all of you have reacted to what are extraordinarily difficult, controversial decisions that are being made. I didn't come into politics to announce cuts to spending on things which people have relied upon. I didn't come into politics in order to say that for those of you working in the civil service and elsewhere in the public sector, we're going to have to take very difficult decisions on pay and pensions and so on. And so I did want to, just if I may, just spend 30 seconds dwelling on why we've embarked on this in the way that we have. And I think what's extraordinarily important to remember, and it's easily forgotten in the kind of flurry of headlines and controversy that clearly swirls around what we're doing at the moment, is that if we had not taken difficult decisions very early on, if we had not announced the controversial budget that we had done, I am absolutely beyond doubt in my own mind that a number of immediate consequences would have occurred. Interest rates would have gone up, which, as any GCSE economic student would have told you, is the surest way to tip the economy into a double-dip recession. There's no doubt, in my view, that we would have quite easily lost control of our own economic destiny. We would have lost sovereignty, if you like, over the decisions we have to take, because our hand would have been forced by the markets. We've been sort of knocking on the door from one European economy to the next. And with the huge deficit we've got, there's no doubt in my mind that they were pounced, or they were ready to force our hand as well. And it seems to me that one of the fundamental principles of any government, and certainly any new government, is to try and assert control over a situation in order that we can then do the things, however difficult they are, on our own terms, rather than have them dictated to us by the markets. And thirdly, I think if one doesn't do these things more quickly than were planned before, then there's no doubt in my mind that we would spend in several years' time billions and billions of pounds of money on servicing our debts, money which could otherwise be spent on the public services, which I know mean a lot to you and a lot to me as well. So it's, of course, always difficult to make the negative case. If we didn't do this, something worse would have happened. But the truth is that really does lurk behind the reason why we've taken the decisions in the first place. The other thing I wanted to say to you is that if we can sort of hang together and grit our teeth and take these decisions with certain sort of principles in mind. I mean, firstly, that this is something we have to do, not because we want to do it. We have to do it. It's not out of any relish. It's not out of any sort of ideological zeal. It's because we have to do it. That's the first thing to remember. Secondly, that where possible, we are, I think, taking big decisions to mitigate the effects of these decisions, so that the most vulnerable do not suffer the most. And this is forgotten in a lot of the polemic around the budget. But, there were some very, very significant decisions taken there. The sort of triple lock to guarantee dignity for the elderly in retirement, allocating billions of pounds extra to the child component of tax credits to make sure that we don't see an increase in child poverty, increasing the personal allowance in the tax system by £1,000 to make sure that people on low pay in particular are keeping more of their money. These are not little embellishments. These are very big steps in order to try and make things fairer, as well as, of course, also trying to balance the books. And it's all for a purpose. Again, I think because of the nature of the controversy, because of the nature of the kind of anguish which I think we all feel as we take these decisions and struggle with these decisions, we've got to remember there is a purpose to all of this. There is light at the end of the tunnel. I want to be able to turn to the British people in 5 years' time, at the end of what will be a fixed-term parliament, 5 years' time, and say, look, of course you didn't like some of the decisions we had to take, but the economy is growing again. You've got more money in your pockets. Your children have got jobs to go to. Our politics is reformed and is more open, more accountable, and more liberal. We've protected your civil liberties. We've given back some of your freedom. We've done some big things to make sure that the agenda for a sort of green, sustainable Britain is significantly advanced. We have introduced big reforms to make sure, in particular, the life chances of children, of all children, are significantly enhanced so that we get over the kind of disfiguring social divisions that still blight the lives of children in our community. That's the objective. That's the objective. And I hope that you will feel through events like this that you're not just being bombarded with a series of difficult and controversial decisions, but that also you feel part of a government which is unique because of its coalition status, but is also having the courage, and I think it is bluntly a brave thing for us to do collectively, to take these difficult decisions, be open about them early on, so that we can then turn to the country in 5 years' time and say, yes, these were difficult decisions, but they were decisions taken for a purpose, a good purpose.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few quick questions then. Firstly, just to give a tiny bit more insight into the reality of how a coalition government works as far as the civil service is concerned. One gets the sense there must be issues on which your party is having to bite its lip in order to get a deal through, especially given the scale of cuts being talked about.
Well, the truth is that the budget, I've seen it written up in the press as a sort of conservative budget, and the Liberal Democrats were standing helplessly at the sidelines. I don't know whether this will be of any comfort to anybody, but it really was a budget on behalf of the coalition. And I don't, I say this, by the way, I'll be very open to some of my own colleagues in my party when, of course, we were struggling as a party whether we should enter a coalition or not. You can't sort of be half in and half out of a coalition. You can't be sort of you can't be sort of half pregnant. You either do this and you do it seriously, you do it together, or you don't do it at all. And it's a very important thing to remember that. And some of the things I referred to were clearly some of the things I talked about, child poverty, the triple guarantee for pensioners, the increase in the allowance, the idea that we've been promoting for years in opposition of a new levy on banks, raising capital gains tax to make the tax system fairer so that you can't get out of paying tax if you're at a high income and relying on capital gains. All those things are things that we brought to the table, and all of them were clearly part of the mix in the budget. But the budget was a blend, as so many of the policies are that we're producing as a coalition government. David Cameron and I have sort of said to each other, a coalition government by definition is one where no party and no person in the coalition should ever feel either entirely victorious or entirely vanquished. I mean, by definition, it's a balance, and if at any time that balance is completely out of whack, it won't work.
Okay. A couple of quick questions then. Why did the coalition government decide to throw away the Labour plan agreed in February, which was accepted by most civil service unions to cut redundancy terms significantly anyway, rather than announce that you're going to do your own thing?
Well, the reason for that, as I think many people here will know better than I do, was that the previous government had a plan. It was accepted by I think the vast majority of the unions, one did not agree, went to court, overturned the decision.
Wouldn't it have been a good place to restart negotiations?
Well, I think what we're trying to do now, given the urgency of things, is to set a floor, if you like, in the arrangements by way of legislation, in order then to negotiate a durable
emergency legislation.
Yes, it is, but it's in order to try and then create the circumstances in which a negotiated settlement between the government and the trade unions can be thrashed out. And I think Francis Maude, I think, was he here yesterday or was he here the day before? I think it's been quite clear that, particularly on voluntary redundancies, this is something where there is real sort of fluidity and flexibility in the approach that we're taking.
Well, I suppose there's concern there's a risk this relationship with the civil service is getting off to actually quite a bad start. Emergency legislation, talk of plans to curb the right to strike. Is this really how you want to start?
I don't know what you're referring to on the latter, but I think in terms of the issue of the redundancy costs, I think most people will accept that we've inherited a very difficult situation because of the court action taken by one trade union, and that there is an urgency needed in order to try and come to an arrangement that everybody can live with. Again, it's like so many things. Would anyone in government like to have to take these kind of decisions early on? No. But if you don't take them, if you don't try and kickstart the process, then it seems to me one's only deferring decisions later, which only become more difficult to take at a later stage.
Okay, quick one. When people talk about the need to look at making 40% budget cuts across the civil service, different departments, is that an absolute or just a negotiating starting point?
Well, you need to ask the sort of chisel-faced characters in the Treasury exactly what their intentions
Prime
are.
Minister.
But clearly what is happening right now, which I think is absolutely sensible, is given the enormity of the fiscal decisions which need to be taken, you need to push everybody very hard to imagine scenarios which they otherwise would not have imagined. In other words, what can you and can you not do with much less money? Does that mean that's the final settlement for each department? Clearly not.
Okay.
Clearly
so
not.
It's not
Clearly, no, of course not. What we're doing at the moment is trying to sort of push people to think through the unthinkable. And that clearly means, in some cases, asking not how you can sort of shave money off everything at once, not sort of salami slice cost savings, but actually think very, very radically about whether we should be doing certain things altogether or not.
Such as?
Well, I'm not going to sort of dive into each and every single policy area, but I don't think we can fill the black hole in the finances unless we also ask ourselves quite fundamental questions. And I don't think it's wrong for all of us to be pushed to ask very fundamental questions about whether we can carry on doing everything we're doing, given that the means to do it are so much narrower and will be for some years ahead.
Got two other questions. What's the obvious stuff you don't like in civil service that has to go? And I can give you 3 examples if you can't come up with any.
Obvious stuff?
Yeah. The culture of sick leave, for example, and the level of sick leave pay. Is that something you think needs to be cut? Yes or no?
No, I'm not. I mean, of course, everybody wants to try and sort of deal with sick leave, but I'm not coming here with a sort of pre-cooked agenda.
Okay.
By the way, this is one of the reasons why I think we have tried to break new ground by actually asking people for their suggestions. I mean, I certainly remember as a politician in opposition, every time I, for instance, would visit a school or a hospital, a teacher or a nurse or a doctor would come up to me and whisper and say, you could save so much money if we didn't have to do this.
But you must have thought of this stuff. I mean, what about
Can I
national...
just speak? I think the change on the scale that we're talking about is not change which can purely be imposed from above. And that's why, whilst everybody, of course, takes a sharp intake of breath when asked to think the unthinkable, it'll make an immense difference if people feel that they, however unwelcome people feel that some of these decisions are, that they're also part authors in those decisions. And it is, we are deadly serious that in terms of the sort of websites that we've launched, the consultation that we've launched, the kind of the exercise that we're now going through, forced, if forced by the requirements from the Treasury, are ones where people genuinely feel they have a stake.
But you're not ruling, obviously, any of these things out. I mean, the other big question people are talking about is trying to move from national pay negotiations to regional ones, which is argued would save a lot of money.
Well, yeah, I don't think, I mean, for instance, I think there's already sort of patchy practice. I think I was reading somewhere that the Ministry of Justice, is that right, already has applied regional pay settlements. Is that something you can apply across the board overnight? Is it something you need to look at? Of course you need to look at it.
Right. Two other questions then. Some would argue that with the talk about the scale of cuts you're talking about on changing to conditions on things like redundancy, pensions, that actually the government is breaking a covenant with the civil service. That most civil servants, my figure I've got from the civil service website, Mythbusters section, is 63% earn below 25,000, and the average is below the national average, and the average pension is 6,700. The deal was they accept lower pay, but in return the conditions are agreed.
Well, two things. Firstly, I think we have been very, very explicit, for instance, on the 2-year pay freeze, to be absolutely clear that for those on 21,000 or less, there is a completely different approach. I think the intention also will be to try and mirror some of that to make sure there is kind of, if you like, special arrangements for those on roughly that kind of salary and below in the negotiations that will now ensue on the redundancy compensation packages. Secondly, I think the most sensitive issue of all, obviously, is pensions. And I, for instance, freely admit that the language that politicians and government ministers use needs to be chosen with care. And I freely admit that I haven't always chosen words perhaps with all the kind of necessary qualifications. So, for instance, I feel very strongly that an MP like myself and people who are on very, very good pay in the public service do have pension entitlements which are totally unsustainable and I think totally unjustifiable. That clearly, that sort of zeal that I feel that we need to have urgent reform of public sector pensions for people at the upper end is not something that you can say can apply in the same way for people who have modest pensions in the public sector. And of course, some of these distinctions and some of that language is sometimes lost. But let me be absolutely clear. I think so far we have demonstrated in the kind of decisions we have taken that we're trying to make a clear distinction all the time between people in the public sector who are very well paid and have got very, very generous pension entitlements, and for those who are having to live on much more modest means, for whom the pension entitlements, which they rightly expect, are absolutely crucial and one of the reasons why they've remained working in the public sector in the first place. I recognise that and recognise that completely. Okay,
my final question is, what lessons have you brought to the role of Deputy Prime Minister, having worked at the very well-paid sort of Brussels gravy train with the European Commission and the European Parliament?
I'll probably try to forget all the lessons that I learned there. This, I think it's so different, to be honest. It's so utterly different. I mean, I worked many, many years ago, working, for instance, for 2 years, managing EU-funded development aid projects in some of the poorest countries in Asia. It was a very, very, very atypical thing to do. I don't think it's really helped me in many ways understand what I'm doing now.
Okay, let's take some questions. We have some roving mics. I'm going to try and take 2 or 3 together. I certainly have more questions, but I'm very conscious this is your event. So if you want to stick your hand up, and I'll try and pick you out. If you want to say who you are or where you work, feel free. Otherwise, you can just direct your question to the Deputy Prime Minister. We'll have a lady over here. There's a lady in pink, the lady in blue, and we have down here in the front row with the tie as well. We'll take these 3 first. Lady in pink first, and then the lady in blue, and then at the front.
My name's Jane Fowler. I work in Revenue and Customs. Obviously, we're all concerned about, the job losses that are happening in the civil service. My concern is, as HMRC is the main revenue-raising body for the government, if you cut jobs in our area, you're effectively stopping the people going out and chasing the tax gap, chasing up defaulters. How do you actually feel about that? And how do you feel, is the government cutting off its nose to spite its face if they make large job cuts in our area in particular?
Okay, I want to take all 3 together, but I'll note them all down if we need reminding. Lady over there, next.
Thank you. I just wanted to check.
Where are you? I can't.
Hi. I just wanted to check. I know you've been very open and honest about saying that you want people to have a say in what's being cut and what's being changed. I know that both health and international development have been ring-fenced from the cuts. Are you going to revisit that in the light that public opinion, as shown in sort of various surveys, especially those on the BBC site, indicate that actually NHS managers and international development are some of the main things that people would like to be cut?
Interesting. Okay, thank you. And the third question in the front here.
Thank you very much. It's Jay here from Jobcentre Plus. The bank's got us in this situation shouldn't the tax levy that's been put on them be a lot higher? And since they seem to be in very good, making loads of profit at the moment, shouldn't they actually pay even more than what they're paying and contribute a lot more because they actually got us in this situation in the first place?
So I misheard that. Was that tax levy on bankers?
On bankers.
Yes, being a lot higher, yeah.
All right. Do you want to do them in order then?
Yes.
Right. So the first one was HMRC question about cutting jobs there, cutting exactly the kind of stuff which is raising tax revenue to pay for everything.
Yeah, no. I totally accept your premise. Is that it would be, it would be totally self-defeating to try and make savings now in a way that actually make it more difficult to increase revenue later. And you know better than I do. There's been a fairly long tradition of making staff cuts at the HMRC, which made it more difficult to close some of the very significant loopholes in our fairly complex tax system. No, we need to try and get the balance right. And again, one of the reasons why all political parties, by the time of the general election, for instance, accepted that we would need to introduce a pay freeze was precisely if a temporary one, is precisely to try and avoid redundancies where they're not justified or where they're not merited. It's again an invidious choice to make, but that is the kind of choice that you're faced with. You either try and save money through pay and other ways of reducing costs, or the pressure becomes ever greater on introducing redundancies, which, as you say, can, of course, lead to higher costs in the long run. That's what we're trying to avoid. It's not easy, but that's what we're certainly trying to avoid. On the NHS and the DFID budget, on NHS, I think it's worth bearing in mind that fairly uniquely of our public services, the kind of increase in demand on the NHS because of an ageing population, because of the costs of care and so on, far, far outstrips the ability of the NHS, even in good times, to sort of meet that demand. So even doing what we're suggesting, which is very modest, real terms increases in the budget for the NHS, is in reality already a huge squeeze on the health system. Health systems all over the developed world are facing the same problem, which is that however much money you put into it, the demand on it constantly outstrips those extra resources. So I don't think it'll feel for anyone working in the NHS, however many, by the way, well-paid managers and layers of bureaucracy that we strip out from the NHS, and we'll be making announcements on precisely that at the beginning of next week. However much you do that, I tell you, it's still going to feel like trying to put a sort of round peg in a kind of square hole. On the banks, if I thought there was a way of stinging the banks...
Sorry, there is a second part of that on DFID, which is the idea that in public opinion, there's potentially quite a strong feeling that you could cut that, actually, when Britain's in crisis.
I think the reality, of course, as you know, is that the DFID budget, even if you did cut it, it's just simply not of the size to then make a material difference to the kind of economies and savings we're having to make elsewhere in Whitehall. And
that's not an argument you deploy when you're talking about, say, slashing the COI budget by half. I mean, that's only hundreds of millions.
True. You could. I suppose you could apply that argument to other things. But what I mean is, it's not a sort of pot of gold that somehow it's not a get-out-of-jail card for all the difficult decisions we're having to make elsewhere. Do I think, having made those kind of moral commitments as a country, as we have done, in the Millennium Development Goals that were adopted in 2000 at Gleneagles, to make sure that come hell or high water, that the developed world needs through thick and thin to make a commitment to the developing world, do I likely think we should sort of retract from that? No, I don't. And I think, of course, I understand how people might question that judgment, but I think it's the right judgment to stick to those commitments. I mean, on banks, if I thought there was a way that we could raise all the money we need to in order to deal with this deficit and avert, as I say, the even worse outcomes of higher interest rates, less money going to schools and hospitals as we pay off our debts in the future, confidence ebbing away from our economy, which means there are less jobs for people to do, just by stinging the banks, I would be the leading advocate of it. I would be manning the barricades now. I have to say to you, having looked into it, in greater detail than I had before, it just ain't that easy.
The Americans are doing more, though, aren't they? They've got a bill through.
They are doing more in some respects, and they're not doing more.
Well, can't we do what they're doing?
Well, they're not doing more actually than us in other respects. We're basically introducing a tax on assets. They're doing it on profits. In my own view, if you really want to know what is the absolute priority as far as banks are concerned now, actually the most important thing by far is to get them lending again. There are I think, two of the most important things for us now as a country and as a community to get us out of this mess is to keep interest rates low and to get the banks lending. It's like blood circulating around a body. If we don't have the banks lending money, and yes, it is our money because we bailed them out in the first place, frankly, the whole thing will seize up. And that is more urgent than anything else, and it's something that we're spending a huge amount of time at the moment trying to get right. It's not easy, but we're going to have to try and do something on that front.
Okay, let's take some more questions. There's a lady over there in a stripy top. There's a lady 3 rows front of the camera in a pink top. And there's one on this side. And then there's a gentleman over here with his arm up. So we'll take them in that order, please. 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, Laura Shepherd from Department for Education. As part of the measures for reducing costs in the civil service, the idea of moving civil servants out to the regions keeps getting brought up. Do you think that'll ever be a really feasible option, given that ministers and all their work is primarily based in London at Parliament?
Okay. Next question.
Hi, my name is Meera Vyas and I'm from Job Centre Plus. As the government is looking at spending review, don't you think we need to reform our benefit system, which is very generous, and it prevents customers to go back into work? I'm talking about benefit given to the single mothers. And what we do is, year on year, if there is addition to the family, we just carry on paying for them. I think it seriously needs to be looked into.
Okay, thank you. And our third question, gentleman over here. Oh, wait a second. Is that mic on? Try speaking again. No, wait, we'll try and swap it. Thank you.
Hi there, Rob Dickman, Department of Health. I work in health, and incidentally, I don't actually agree that health should be ring-fenced in the way that you've put across. But I'm also wondering whether it's slightly schizophrenic to be cutting so deeply, and yet Mr. Lansley wishes to embark on what is going to be complex and expensive system reorganisation in the NHS. So I wonder how that circle squares.
Okay, good. Do you want me to remind the first one for the
No,
audience?
I remember it. As the MP for South West Sheffield, Sheffield Hallam, which I think has got, more people working in the public sector than almost any other constituency in the country, and aware as I am that lots of you in Sheffield work, for instance, in the DWP and other agencies which have been transferred out of London in the past, I think it's perfectly feasible. It's perfectly feasible. I mean, whether that really, suits Department X or Department Y.
Do you think it's feasible to regionalise more jobs?
Yeah, personally, as a sort of passionate decentraliser, I think the more we can try and kind of, maybe we should move, the Treasury to the Orkneys or something.
How much
and
that
might
cost?
give them a different perspective. But no. I mean, I've got no problem. I've got this idea that everything needs to be located in London is not true anyway now, and I don't think it needs to be true in the future. And with modern technology, there's absolutely no reason for having everybody cheek by jowl in the same place.
With modern technology, they're talking about taking jobs and selling them to India, aren't they?
I don't think we're proposing to transfer any
absolutely
Whitehall
no
departments
plans
to India.
No. But in terms of call centres, there's been serious talk about whether you
call
could
centres
transfer some of those admin jobs that are part of the civil service out.
I mean, what you do with sort of back office functions is one thing, but I think what you're talking about is the actual sort of core of the civil service, and that has been decentralised outside London, and I'm sure we could do more of that if we wanted to.
Okay. Second question was about...
Second question, I mean, I mean, look, we all know, and you know better than I do, that there is a real issue about the incentives of work and benefits. It's immensely complex. It's become more complex over time. The welfare bill has increased very, very dramatically. What is it? Over £190 billion in total now. And I'm absolutely sure that with parallel reforms to our tax system, so that you make low pay in particular rewarding, quite literally rewarding, and our step, for instance, in this budget of increasing the personal allowance from £6,500 to £7,500 is towards our ultimate goal of raising the personal allowance to £10,000 is a very, very radical step in that direction, combined with changes to benefits must all be coordinated for one sole purpose, which is to encourage people to work where they can and where they want to. I'm like any other constituency MP. I am so disheartened by the number of people I meet who just feel it's not quite worth it. That isn't right. It's morally wrong. You know, I'm a sort of fairly old-fashioned liberal like that. I think work is really, really important for people's self-respect, for their self-worth, and so on. And we can't. It's just not. We can't tolerate a situation where we're making it actually, less attractive for people to work where we can. Ian Duncan-Smith and his team, the DWP, are looking at this right now. I don't know when they'll complete their work, but the objective is precisely to come forward with some suggestions about how we can make the reforms necessary so that, of course, we can continue to provide support to people who need it and deserve it and so on, but do so in a way that doesn't impinge on people's incentive to work. I mean, on the NHS reforms, do I think trying to make savings but also introduce reforms at the same time is illogical? And actually, no, I slightly sort of see it probably from the other end of the telescope. I almost think they have to go hand in hand. I, for instance, have for a long time harboured a prejudice against strategic health authorities. You may or may not agree, but I just think it's a layer of NHS administration, the purpose of which I don't, frankly, entirely understand. I think there's a lot of duplication at the moment in terms of decision-making and administrative sort of power within the NHS. That can be looked at, and I think those are reforms which, if they're done sensibly, if they're done openly, if they're done with proper consultation, can both improve the NHS, make it more accountable, more easy to understand for people who use it, but also save some money along the way. I don't think those two things have to pull in opposite directions.
But do you acknowledge that under the Labour government there was an awful lot of reorganisation and an awful lot spent on consulting for it? Real questions about how much money was really saved at the end of the day.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I've got hospitals in my constituency who, the finance officers have told me in the past of eye-watering figures of how much money was needed to implement payment by results, foundation hospital status, and whatever it's called, Agenda 2000. Was that what it was called? The reorganisation of the pay grades in the NHS all at once. And that rushing all those reforms at once actually costs a great deal of money. We have to learn those. We have to learn those lessons. Undoubtedly, we do. But do I think, in principle, it is that one has to sort of fossilise the way things are organised and the way things are run while we try and make savings? No, I don't accept that.
Okay. Next questions, please. Right. I'm going to take three over there, and then I'll come onto this side. So the lady over there, then there's a lady in green in front, and then a lady further forward in the kind of a green patterned top with a hairband. Yes, you over there. And then there's one behind you as well, the lady in the green mic there. But we'll take the one at the back first. Yes, go ahead.
Great. Hi, Helen Gibson from Job Centre Plus. I just wondered, you said that you'd felt that the cuts had been misrepresented in the media as unfairly hitting some of the most vulnerable in our society. So I just wondered, if you wanted to set the record straight, can you paint us a picture of how you actually see the coalition government targeting those at the bottom of our society and actively improving their lives, especially in the light of cuts to some provisions such as the Child Trust Fund?
Okay, second question, please. A lady in green. Yep.
I'm Jo from Revenue and Customs. With all the job cuts that have been proposed in civil service, it's been mooted that the private sector would provide jobs. Where are they going to come from? Because I've looked in the paper on a weekly basis, and the jobs that are in there are more from the public sector rather than the private sector.
Thank you. And the lady with the hairband. Thank
you. I'm Joanne Fern, and I work in the Cabinet Office for the Social Exclusion Task Force. My question is to seek your views on what you would think of are the best ways to achieve efficiencies through better joined-up working across government on issues that do cross departmental boundaries. Siloed working and the challenge to reduce that is something that's come up repeatedly, and it feels like now is more of a time than ever to really tackle it. On the social exclusion agenda, there is the new Social Justice Cabinet Committee, which is obviously one way of bringing departments together, but do you think there are more radical ways that we should be attempting to join up efforts across government?
Okay, so the first one is about how could you explain how cuts are being misrepresented and how you're targeting those and improving the lives of people who perhaps are at the bottom?
Well, first, let me. I'm not going to try and sort of prettify something that isn't easy. The kind of fiscal retrenchment we're talking about, on the scale we're talking about, and on the time scale we're talking about, is not a sort of pain-free exercise. So I don't want to sort of appear sort of daft or naive about that. But I just think if you compare what we announced, for instance, in the budget compared to previous budgets in the 80s and early 90s, if you compare what we announced in the budget compared to the way other countries have done it, where they've had big crises like this, the Clinton administration in the 90s, the Swedish government in the 1990s, the Liberal government in Canada, I think some of the things that we have done, I've mentioned some of them before, the absolute guarantee we're giving to pensioners, that their pension is going to rise either by 2.5% or by inflation or by earnings, the very, very significant additional amount of money into the child tax credit system. I mean, huge sums in that. The allowance that I've talked about as well. I mean, those are very big material differences which protect the young in particular, the elderly, and seek to try and help people, particularly on low pay. Does that mean that Does that mean that there is no pain or difficulty involved in these decisions? No, of course not. It is frankly impossible to do that. If you look at the kind of distributional map that was, or graph that was published by the Treasury at the time, the top 10% do pay more as a consequence of this budget. They do make a greater contribution. Across almost all income scales, the burden is distributed fairly. There is, however, I'll be quite open about it, there is a particular issue about trying to reach single people without children who are not in work. It's quite difficult, given all the other adjustments we've made, to reach them. But we really grappled with this week in, week out in the budget, and I think we have been very transparent, more than any previous government has been, in the kind of information we published on what the distributional effects were. And look, I'm not going to start complaining about media misrepresentation. It just so happens to be the case that quite a lot of the assumptions that some of the sort of think tanks published afterwards were assumptions which begged a lot of questions. They assumed, for instance, that we're not going to do anything to improve fairness in future budgets. That's an assumption which I can guarantee you I will challenge. We will in future budgets, yes, have to continue to make difficult decisions, but not on the scale, I predict, of this budget. This budget was an attempt to try and be as open as possible about what needs to happen over the next 4 or 5 years, rather than constantly returning to people over and over again. But of course we will continue to make adjustments, for instance, in the tax system, to make it ever fairer. And not an easy balance to strike. But certainly, I think if you compare it to other countries and other budgets, it's we've been taking some very big decisions in order to try and mitigate the effects.
Okay, second question, lady from Revenue and Customs: where are all these private sector jobs coming from to replace public sector ones?
No, the kind of handover of the baton, if you like, from the public sector to the private sector is not straightforward, and I disagree with those economists and others who are almost on a sort of ideological basis sort of somehow say, oh, you just need to reduce the public sector and somehow magically a sort of 1,000 flowers will bloom in the private sector. I don't believe that for 1 minute, and there's no evidence that is the case. That is actually returning to the question on banks, why I think it is so urgent that we make sure that the private sector is supported by the banks. At the moment, in effect, what's happening, as far as I can see, is that the banks are kind of offering money to companies and businesses in the private sector, but on terms and at rates which of course make it very unattractive to seek loans in the first place. So people don't seek loans, and then the banks turn around to us in government and say, well, no one's asking for money, so there's no demand for it. Well, that's a nonsense. We have to try and make sure that the money is lent or is offered by banks in the first place on more reasonable terms, so that you then get liquidity going, which I'm absolutely sure along with low interest rates, persistent low interest rates, is a way to help.
But in the
really
short term, I mean, just, the reality is if you're looking for a job because you lose your job in the civil service, waiting for, businesses to gradually be able to borrow more and offer new jobs, I mean, there's a huge gap in terms of the time it'll take for that to happen, isn't there?
Yes, it is. I don't think any of this, of course, is an overnight process.
But job losses will be overnight, won't they?
No, I don't think they will be overnight. I don't think that is... No. There's no there's no overnight sword of Damocles which will, lead to those overnight results. No, absolutely not. That's one of the reasons I say again why I think what we did was the right thing to do on the budget. Look, in a sense, the politically more convenient thing to do would have been to only give a partial picture in the budget and do what happened in previous budgets, where you only budget for 6 months or for a year. But what we did this time was budget for a parliament. And yes, of course, that meant that the sort of full gory details or the full gory scale of what we're trying to do was there for everyone to see. But it also, I think, allows us together to try and then plan how we get from A to B in a much more thought through and hopefully also fairer manner than we would have done if we'd instead replaced that with sort of panicky budgets year after year after year. And that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, the third question was about best ways to achieve efficiencies. Could you give examples? The Social Justice Cabinet Committee was given as an example of trying to do more joined-up thinking to achieve these efficiencies.
I think there are a lot. I think there's so many. I think the areas where you can sort of try and cut across government silos and departments so that we get beyond the kind of balkanized thinking of departmental approaches is legion. From drugs to rehabilitation, from social mobility to youth unemployment. All of these things have to draw on housing, on criminal justice, on education, and all of them need to be drawn together. I think what we have tried to do in the coalition government, actually, interestingly, precisely because it is a coalition government can't survive unless there is a high degree of transparency between the decision makers in a coalition government. A coalition government, by definition, is cemented by a degree of trust between people who have for a long time been very distrustful of each other. So it's baked in the cake that a coalition government requires a degree of transparency, which actually, ironically, you don't sometimes need in single-party government. And that's why we have, I think, seen a return of cabinet government and collective government. I chair the Home Affairs Cabinet Committee, a cabinet committee which covers the whole full sort of waterfront of domestic policy, from immigration to health, from education to welfare reform. And what we're finding in that structure is, yes, actually quite a kind of stimulating environment where people are starting to realise that we're pursuing the same objectives, but we need to work together to do that. So I hope we will be able to use that catalyst, if you like, of the coalition government to work across departmental silos.
Yeah, I want to take 3 more. I feel that may be our last. What's the lady down here who wants to ask? Lady here, gentleman there, and lady over here. Those are. I can't guarantee it'll take me any more than that just because of time. Let's see how we go. So, lady in red first, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then the lady dressed in black.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Warren. I work at HMRC.
Where are you?
I'm
Sorry,
here.
on the right.
Right
hello,
here.
hello.
Hi, Nick. I'd like to start by saying thank you so much for coming. You've really put yourself on the firing line here, and you've dealt with some really tough questions.
As long as you do it to the Prime Minister tomorrow, then it's fine.
Unfortunately, I won't be here to ask this question tomorrow, but I'm sure someone else will be. Presumably, you're here to engage with us as your workforce, basically.
Yes.
And I find you very engaging. I think some of the ideas that you've got are great. What really, really disengaged me after 24 years of public service was when you allegedly said that public sector pensions were disgraceful, right? I felt really let down, upset about that. So my questions are, 1, did you say it? And 2, what have you got to say about it now?
Let's answer that right now. Yeah? Let's answer that right now, because it's a straightforward question, and then we'll move on. Yeah?
Thanks for being so straightforward. I don't think I used the word disgraceful, or at least I hope I didn't. I did use the word. I think the word that caught the most attention was gold-plated. And of course, it doesn't feel to you, I don't know what in your case, that your pension is gold-plated, particularly if you've been earning a relatively modest income in the public sector. As I said before, I do think there are pension arrangements for people like me, for MPs, for instance, and numerous other people on well above average incomes in the public sector, which I think are unsustainable and are very, very difficult to justify given the huge, huge change in pension entitlements for millions and millions of British citizens in the private sector, and frankly compared to the much more modest pensions that people enjoy elsewhere in the public sector. And I'm perfectly free to admit that kind of distinction, if you like, is one that should be made. I think I did make it in those comments, but look, clearly particular adjectives and adverbs get fished out at times like that, and it certainly wasn't meant to elicit the kind of reaction that clearly you had.
You happy? Okay, fine. Gentleman here, and then the lady on the right. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm from the UK Border Agency, and I wouldn't disagree that for these very difficult times we do need a different civil service, and I'm happy about that. But one that's still underpinned by the values of impartiality and integrity that have served us so well over the last few hundred years. So really up for those tough decisions that you talk about. Personally, I think working for 30 years and getting a pension is too generous. I do think that our compensation schemes in the past where you could get 6 years are too generous, and they do none of us any favours actually, because most of us aren't on those sorts of benefits actually. And as a leader in the organisation, I will serve you to make those and see through those tough changes, as well as I would any other government, and as I have done with the previous government. What I would say to you, as some advice though, is that there's a fine line between presenting those tough challenges, which lots of us are actually up for, on the one hand, and doing that in a way which can look like it's vilifying a service that, through your tenure in office, will support you incredibly well with pace, passion, pride and professionalism, which our chief over there talks about.
What is it? Pace, pride?
It's the 4 Ps that Sir Gus O'Donnell coined a few years ago, and they've stuck because they're very good. But the point is this: is that
brownie points.
We will bend over backwards to implement your agenda. Some of it's tough, some of it we don't like, but we will do it. Yeah. But please don't make us do that in a way where we are vilified for doing that, because we work incredibly hard. And I can just say, in terms of sick leave culture, I've been here 10.5 years and I haven't had one day off. So I'm not sure where you get your sick culture from. Thanks.
Okay, lady over here.
Hello, I'm Nana from the Peterborough Job Centre.
From?
Peterborough Job Centre Plus. I'd like to know how you're going to keep us motivated as civil servants, which affects efficiency when we're faced with huge cuts, lower pensions, possibilities of job losses, and increased job workloads, because that will happen.
Well, I think the two questions, if I may, are sort of connected. Firstly, of course, we have no right to even ask you to do the amazing work that you do if you feel vilified. And you should kick back very hard if you think anyone in government is vilifying you. As I said in my opening remarks, I didn't come into politics to be sort of neck high in these very, very difficult decisions and having to make these very unwelcome announcements. I genuinely think that they are forced upon us. I genuinely think, short of being able to stick in the banks for several billion extra pounds, there are certain things that we just have to do. If we don't do them now, it seems to me our hand will be forced to only make worse decisions later. Everything that we're doing is because we have to do, not because there's any relish, not because there's any ideological zeal, not because there's any prejudice against the public sector. If you feel that's coming across, that is wrong. It's not, I can guarantee it's not what I feel, it's not what the Prime Minister feels, it's not what this coalition government stands for. And let me be utterly unambiguous about that. I am a huge, huge admirer of everyone who goes into public service in order to pursue fantastic ideals which should only ever be admired and celebrated, never trashed or vilified. And if you feel we've got that balance wrong, I will take that to heart, because I think that is wrong and it's not fair on you. The other thing I would say is this. I think we're at the very, very worst point in the cycle at the moment, because in a sense we're all, and you in particular, are having to face the unknown. Every day we open the newspaper and we see yet more lurid headlines about the axeman cometh, and this is going to be lost, and that's going to be snatched away, and that's going to be slashed, and that's going to be cut. And I think one of the worst fears is, of course, the fear of the unknown, because the fear of the unknown always makes one fear the very, very worst. And so one of the things I do think we need to do, and I think it would be failing in our duty in government and as politicians in government to you, is to try and minimise this uncertainty as much as possible, to move forward as quickly as we can. And we are trying to do that, but I think it's very difficult to do what we're trying to do on the scale that we're trying to do any quicker than what we're doing. I hope, in a sense, once a lot of the decisions have worked through the system, on pay, on jobs, on pensions and so on, maybe we might meet here in a year's time and find that it's not quite as bad as we presently fear. I'm not making that as an assurance, because I don't know what the outcome is going to be of the decisions we're going to have to take. But I do feel that at the moment we're in the very, very worst of all worlds, which is that everybody's braced for very difficult decisions, but we don't know what the nature of them are. And that's why I think, A, we need to listen to you, and we're genuinely doing that. The Prime Minister and I were just talking just the other day, funny enough, about some specific suggestions which have been made on the website about how to make savings made by you. So please don't think that you're not being listened to. We really are sort of fishing them out, looking at them, see if we can put them into practice. And secondly, we have a duty to you, A, to not vilify you, B, celebrate and thank you for what you're doing, but C, try and move through this phase of uncertainty as quickly as possible.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For being here.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.